Hello and welcome to today's session on OAuth and OIDC. We are going to cover the basics and understand the flows. Like my previous videos, I'm not going to go into the theory part as there's a lot of theory available out there already. What we are going to do is work on a real example, do the practical, and understand the concept. I'm going to walk you through each flow so that you understand how it works and troubleshoot basic issues. We will not go into the development, it's only for troubleshooting. If you want to go through the theory, I recommend watching Octave videos. They are available on YouTube and they're really good. All right, my name is Ash. Let's begin. First, let's understand the terminologies used in OAuth and OIDC. We have our resource owner, who is the user and owner of the data. He's the one launching the application or the client. Client is the app that is accessed by the user, and this is the app that requires authorization. Authorization server is going to authorize the said client and issue a code or a token depending on what is requested. Resource server hosts the data that the client wants to access, and if it is not authorized to do so, it will go to the authorization server to get authorized. Authorization grant or response type tells the authorization server as to what kind of flow it is, whether it's a code flow or an implicit flow or a combination of both, which is called hybrid flow. Redirect URI is the place where the client lands after getting authorized. Scope is what the client wants to do with the data or what kind of access it would get. After getting the token, the client can access the data hosted on the resource server, but what kind of access would it have is defined by scope. And then we have our tokens. We are going to look into ID and access tokens today. For all of this to work, we must have a client and an authorization server. The client must be registered in the authorization server and it should know the endpoints. For this exercise, I've created an account in Octave and registered a Postman client. Let's have a quick look at the authorization server. Let me log into Okta and walk you through the setup. Oh, by the way, that's not my personal email address, it's the email address that I never use. All right, let it log in. In Okta, you go to Applications at the top to add a client or an app. I've already done it. And here's my app. Let me go inside. When I registered the app, it gave me this client ID and client secret. These are the flows that I've enabled for my client, and I've kept the consent off because it's an internal app and I trust it. And here are the redirect URIs that I've added. If I go back to the grant types, you can see that I've enabled the code and implicit flow. If I uncheck the implicit flow, okay, for that I'll have to edit. If I uncheck the implicit flow, then then my client cannot make the implicit call. It can only make the authorization code call. So let me go back to edit and enable this. Click on save. And we are going to look into all that when we do the demo. For my client to know that it has to go to this Okta server for authorization, it needs to know the endpoints. The endpoints are available in the metadata URI of that server. The metadata for Okta is under API, authorization servers, and then I go to my server. And then I click on this URL. You can see the endpoints on this page. Here's the issuer, the authorization endpoint, and the token endpoint. Authorization endpoint is where the client will come to get authorized. The token endpoint is accessed by the client to exchange the code for the token. There are other endpoints also, for example, the user info endpoint, which is used to get more information about the user. Then we have these response types. telling us what kind of flows the server supports, and we shall look into all these when we do the demo. It also tells us what scopes are supported. For our demo, I've added a custom scope which I've not exposed here. All the information that you see on this page are publicly available. It's up to the admin on what he wants everyone to see. I've created a custom scope just for my client. It is not a global scope and may not be used by other apps, hence I've kept it hidden. But if I were to expose it, I'd go back to the server, go to the scopes, and just expose it. Click on save, go back here, refresh it, and now I have it. Now let me go back and take it out. All right. Now that we have covered all these, let's go back to the presentation and understand the flows in detail, after which we shall do the practical. I'm going to do the demo of code flow and implicit flow, which are the most common. So where's my presentation? All right. For authorization code flow, the response type will be code, and this is predefined in the spec. Here we have a client, the user, and the authorization server with authorization endpoint and token endpoint as we just saw in Okta before. We have this user who's running all that, which is me. The first step is the client is going to access the authorization endpoint of the authorization server. It will be a GET request, and these are going to be the parameters passed in the query string. It will have client ID, redirect URI, a response type, which is code, and scope. I've just taken profile and example, but when we do the demo, we will use the test scope that I've created. By the way, there are other parameters also like state and nonce, and we will look into it when we do the demo. The authorization endpoint is going to present a login screen to the user, and after login, the authorization endpoint is going to issue a code to the client because that's what was requested. The client will then make another request, generally a post, to the token endpoint to exchange the code for the token. And these will be passed in the body of the request as its post. The token endpoint is then going to issue an access token to the client. This is an OAuth flow. If I include OpenID in the scope, it will become an OIDC flow. And I will get an ID token along with access token. It's the same flow. The client goes to authorization endpoint. It's a GET request. These are the parameters. The user authenticates. Client gets the authorization code, and then the client exchanges it for an access token. The only difference is the scope is OpenID here, and I'm gonna get an additional token, IdToken, along with access token. All right, it's time for demo. So let me open my Postman. Let me click on this tab. All right, so the first step is to access the authorization endpoint. So let me go back to the server. Here is my authorization endpoint. Go back to Postman. And it's going to be a GET request. And I will pass all the parameters in the query string. So that is why I select params here. And let's start putting in the parameters. So client ID. By the way, the order of the parameters do not matter. Um, client ID. Let me go back to my application. Client ID was already there on the previous screen, but anyway, uh, let me put that in here. And you can see that as I put these values, the query string changes. Then we have the redirect URI. Let me go back to the server and get the redirect URI. Then we have our response type, which is code. Scope is the one that I added. And let's put in state. State is just a random string that the client sends over to authorization server, and authorization server returns the same state, which tells us that that this flow has not been tampered with. All right, now that we have this URL, let me go here, open an incognito window. Second step was the authorization endpoint is going to give me the user login screen. So that is what I'm getting here. Let me sign in. And I'm going to get back a code. So this is the extension that I use. It just parses the values. So this is the code that I got. Now, the client has this code, authorization code. It needs to be exchanged for an access token. And for that, I need to go to the token endpoint. And token endpoint request is generally a post request. So let me go to Postman, open a new tab, and I have to go to authorization endpoint. I'm sorry, token endpoint. So let me take the token endpoint, go to Postman. This is going to be a post request. And I'm going to pass these values in the body, form URL encoded. So let me put the client ID, which I have here. And here I'm going to put the client secret as well. Using the client ID and the client secret, the code will be exchanged for the token. So let me go back to Postman. Then I am going to put the redirect underscore URI. Then the code that I got from my previous try. So this is the code. Let me put the code here. And grant type is code. All right, let's make this request. Let me click on send. Client authorization field, either the client or client credentials. I misspelled secret. Let me try again. Click on send. Unsupported grant type. Authorization is not supported. Okay, let me go to the metadata. Grant. Okay, it's authorization code. It's not code. So let me take this. The grant type is authorization code. Let me click on send now. Authorization code is invalid or has expired, of course, because the code is valid only for some time, but it expired by the time we got here. So we're gonna have to make another request. Let me take this URL. Let me close this one. Open a new incognito window. Make a request. Log in. Get the code. go to Postman, go to Post, put the new code, click on Send. And we have our access token. To see the information in the access token, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to go to this browser extension that I have for JWT. Take this off, put the token information. You can also do this if you go to jwt.io, open a new tab, put the address, and let it load. Wow, my internet is really slow. All right. So you can see the token information here, but why do this when you have this extension? You will save extra clicks. All right, let me go back to Postman. This was the complete flow. Let me walk you through this flow again. So let me go back to my presentation. The first step was the client is going to access the authorization endpoint in my Postman. This was the authorization endpoint, and it is going to send a GET request with client ID, redirect URI, response type, scope, which we have done here. Client ID, redirect URI, response type, scope, and state is another parameter that I put in here. It was going to present a login screen, which it did, and I logged in, and then I got the authorization code, which I got here. Then I exchanged that code for the token, and then I made a post request to the token endpoint. I made a post request to the token endpoint, and I got the ID token. I'm sorry, I got the access token. Here it says ID token because it has OpenID scope added, which I've not added. But if I do that now, right, let me go back and put OpenID. By the way, before I put OpenID, this is an OAuth flow. As soon as I put OpenID, it will become an OIDC flow. So let me take this URL and let me go back to the browser, close this one and open a new browser. By the way, I'm not going to open an incognito because it is asking me to log in again and again. And since I've already logged in to the authorization server, it will not ask me to log in again since I'm already logged in. Response type is not supported. By the authorization server. Let me see. I'm sorry. Instead of putting that in scope, I put that in response type. Let me take this URL again and let's do this. All right, I got the code. Now let's take this code, go back to Postman, put this code here, and click on send. Now I'm going to get access token and ID token. Access token here and ID token here. If you want to see the information of the ID token, just copy it, go to this browser extension. You can see the information of the ID token. Now, let me show you the browser extension that I use to troubleshoot the OAuth issues. This is called RC Federation Tracer. It contains all the tries that we just did. So let me make a fresh try. Let me delete all that and let me show it to you again. I have this URL. Now you can see if I click on the first one, I get this pop-up and it tells me what is the client ID, what is the redirect URI, what is the response type, and all the parameters. And the second one, this is the callback URL. This is the code and the state. So let me go back to the first request, right? It has the destination URL, which is the authorization endpoint. So if you use this extension, you will be able to know as to what client it is and all the other information. If the user is getting an error, you can get the error URL from the user and you can access that URL and you can see what the client ID is, then go to the application, your IDP server, go to that client and see what kind of configuration the client has, and you can see whether or not all this information is matching. So this is code. Uh, this client is doing code flow, whether or not the code flow is available for that client, and you know things like that. It's a very good extension. It not only captures OAuth, it captures SAML and WS Federation traffics as well. All right, now let me go back to Postman and show you another way of getting access token. This thing that we did is a long way, and I don't prefer this way. The way I prefer is going to Authorization tab from the type, click on the drop down and select OAuth 2. I have the information already filled here, but let me clear the cookies and we're going to do again. The token name is access token. It can be any name, it doesn't matter. It can be just demo token, and we're doing this for authorization code. I have the callback URL here. I have the authorization endpoint or auth URL. Then I have access token URL here, the client ID and client secret. What's this? Use video. Okay. So I'm using the actual client ID and client secret. It is recommended to use variables, but for the sake of this demo, I'm not doing it. The scope is test and the state is 1, 2, 3, 4. It doesn't matter what the state is. Client authentication, send client credentials in body, and let me click on get new access token. It opened a window. Let me log in. Click on sign in. All right. Um, I got this access token. The name of the token is demo token. It doesn't matter what the name is. And here is my access token. If I copy this and go to this browser extension, I can see all the information. So this is a better way of requesting for a token instead of doing the actual flow. I use this just to show you how the transfer happens. But if you were to request for a token, use our authorization tab. All right, now this is code flow. Let's look into implicit flow. So let me go back to my demo. I'm sorry, let me go back to my presentation. All right, for implicit flow, the response type is going to be token. It's the same flow. The client is going to go to the authorization endpoint. The response type is going to be token, and user will be authenticated. And I will get the access token from the authorization endpoint itself. Client will not go to token endpoint to exchange the code for the token because there is no code. Client wanted the access token and client got the access token from the authorization endpoint itself. It doesn't have to go to token endpoint. Let's see how that works in Postman. So let me go back to Postman. Um, Go to patterns. It's going to be a GET request. Um, Client ID, redirect URI. Response type is token. And let me take the OpenID scope off for now. And I'll tell you why I'm doing that. Let me click on send. Okay, yeah, so instead of clicking on send, I should take the URL and go to the browser because I don't think Postman can handle the login. It will just display the login page. It doesn't know what to do with the with that information. So if I go to preview, right, this is what it came back to. So let me go to browser. Nonce parameter. Okay, so for implicit flow, we need a nonce, another parameter nonce. Again, it's a random string, so it doesn't matter what I put. Let me take this URL. And I have the access token now. So if I go to this extension, I can see the access token here, and I can see the information of that access token. Did I not copy the right field? Um, yeah, okay. So this is my access token. Now, let's look into another response type. Let me go back to my presentation. ID token. When the response type is ID token, is same as token or implicit flow, but instead of access token, we're going to get ID token. ID token contains user information, and I cannot run this ID token response type without including the OpenID scope, and I'll explain why. So let me um, change the response type to ID token, and I'm not putting the OpenID scope here. Let me run and see what happens. Let me go to the browser. Okay, so it says that required scope is OpenID. OpenID is required here because when I request for an ID token, it becomes an OIDC flow. And for a flow to be OIDC, I need to have OpenID scope present. So let me take this URL and try again. I have the ID token now. Oh, by the way, when we did the implicit flow and when we are doing this ID token flow, you can see the ID token and access token in the URL string itself. That is why it is discouraged to use ID token or token flow, because if somebody is watching a network, they can see the access token, they can steal your access token, and they can access the data on your behalf. That is why we do not recommend implicit flows for external clients, um, uh, especially because it's not secure. Internally, if you have internal applications, sure, but still, I would not recommend using implicit flow even for internal applications. All right, so let me go back to my extension, take the ID token. Here's the information. All right, now let's look at another flow, which is ID token and token. Now, when it's ID token, I'm going to get an ID token. When the response type is also token, I'm going to get the access token. It's the same flow. It's just that I'm going to get additional token here, which is access token. And the response type is going to be ID token and token. For obvious reasons, it will not go to the token endpoint because the client wanted access token and it got it from the authorization endpoint itself. It doesn't need to go to the token endpoint. So there's no post in this. So it will just go to this authorize, um, which was the authorization endpoint, right? And post was the token endpoint. I don't need to go to the token endpoint. I can get all the information from the authorization endpoint itself. So let me do token here. Let me take this URL, go to the browser, close this. All right, now I have a ID token and access token. I have ID token and access token and some other information about the flow. Let's go back to the presentation and look at another flow. This is CodeIDToken. This is also called hybrid flow, which is a combination of code flow and token flow. So client is going to go to the authorization endpoint, authentication will happen, and authorization point is going to give the authorization code because the response type is code, and also ID token because the response type is ID token. Now, since it has a code, it doesn't have the access token to access the resource that it wants. It has the authorization code. It will make another call to the token endpoint to exchange that code for the access token. Let's see how it works in Postman. So I'm gonna do, let me take out token and put code. This is code and ID token. Yeah. All right. So let me take this URL and go to the browser. Okay. Now I have ID token and I have code. This code needs to be exchanged for an access token because I still do not have the access token. And to get the access token, to exchange the code, I need to go to the token endpoint. So this is my token endpoint and this is my code. Click on send. All right, I have the access token now, and I will also have an ID token here. All right, let's look at another response type, which is code and token. So the client is going to make a request to the authorization endpoint. The authentication will happen. I will get the access token because the response type is token, and I will also get an authorization code because the response type is code. Then, since it has the response type is code, it has to exchange it for the token. Although I have the token, access token already here, it will still make that extra call to exchange that code for the token. So let's see how that works. Go to Postman. Um, it is token and code. Yep. Take the URL, go to the browser. It is not asking me to authenticate because I'm already logged into the authentication server. Sorry, to the authorization server. If I do this in, let me do that in incognito, like I did before. It will ask me to authenticate. And then it is going to give me the access token and the code. So this is my access token and this is my code. Let me take this code and make a post request to the token endpoint. This is my new code. And let me click on send. I'm going to get an access token here. And I'm also getting an ID token because I have open ID here. If I take the open ID, I shouldn't be getting an ID token here. Let me go back to my presentation. I shouldn't be getting an ID token because, well, I did not request for it, but still I have the scope as OpenID. So let me take the OpenID away and make another request. Um, all right, access code, and this is my code. Let me go to Postman, make another request, and click on send. Now it has only access token. Now let's look at another response type, which is okay. So OpenID included. I just covered it. So um, in if the scope contains OpenID, I will have the access token and the ID token as we just saw. So I think this is already covered. Let's look at the next one, which is CodeToken and ID token. So let me go to Postman, um, CodeToken and ID underscore token. And since I have this ID token, I need to have OpenID scope here. Let me take the URL, copy this, go to the browser. Okay, So this is going to contain the ID token, the access token, and the code. By the way, this is a hybrid flow. Copy this code, go to Postman, make a post request to the token endpoint to exchange the code for the token. Click on send. I have the access token and the ID token, which is what we wanted. Let me go back to the presentation. So I have the ID token access. I have the ID token, access token, and the code from the first call that we saw. Let me go back to the browser. I had ID token, access token, and the code, and then we exchanged the code with the access token, and along with that, I also got the ID token. So let me go back to Postman. So I got the access token and an ID token. All right, that concludes our session today. Should you have any questions or comments, please let me know in the comment section. Thank you.